Evening, it's 6:30 on my watch. Thank you for coming. I'm really happy you're here tonight because in a way I designed the entire mini course, if you will, to culminate and to be the most, I won't say interesting, but the most relevant to us today. Because if you remember, we started with the Bible, that was class 1, the concept of evil and suffering in the Bible. Last week, we talked about rabbinic Judaism, mostly the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, etc. And today, we are going to delve into the modern era. A lot of what you'll see was written after and as a reaction to the Holocaust. Okay, because the Holocaust was not just another event. It was not just another pogrom. It's a game changer, even philosophically, theologically speaking. Okay, so I have a lot of what we call the post-Holocaust theologies or philosophies. But let me start the way I started the previous two classes and present the question in the most accurate way I can come up with. We have an assumption that God is three things: omnipotent, which means all-powerful; omniscient or omniscient, both pronunciations, by the way, are correct; all-knowing, meaning God knows everything, God can do anything; and all-good. God is only good. Which leads to the problem of how come there is so much bad, so much suffering, so much evil in the world? How can a perfect God that is good allows evil? Okay? So that's the basic question. So one answer is to say that God is not one of these things. Either God is not omnipotent, God doesn't have all the power in the world, God is limited. Or God does not know everything. God has the power, but does not have the knowledge, for example, of how to prevent suffering. Or that God is not good. Or that another option is that what we perceive to be evil or suffering, from God's perspective, it's not. We're very limited. From our perspective, maybe, it's bad. Probably when we walk around, we kill many ants. Unintentionally, we're good people. I mean, we'll never step on an ant. But I assume it makes sense, right? That each one of us killed dozens, if not hundreds of ants. So from our perspective, we don't think about it. But from their perspective, there are these giants, people, or creatures that just wants to kill us. So maybe we're just ants, and from our perspective, all our big problems and suffering and pain is huge. But when you look at the universe, what's the big deal? Somebody in Palm Beach Gardens, Jupiter, just doesn't feel good. And that's one of the reasons that people are attracted to the ocean and to big mountains. Because you stare at the ocean and you feel, whoa, I'm nothing. No matter how big and important you think you are, we're not so significant. And the same with these huge mountains. You look, wow. It's not about me. I'm really much less important than I thought. Okay, so this is the problem. And when we looked at the Bible and rabbinic text, we saw that the main answer is there is suffering because we deserve it. We messed up. God told us what to do and what not to do, and sometimes we defy God and God punishes us. From the very beginning, God said to Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit, they ate the fruit, punishment. Okay, but that's simplistic, because we know that there are cases in which people are good and they still suffer. So say, maybe the punishment comes on because not that the person committed crimes or transgressions, but because their parents did, or their children did, or something, or they're part of a community of sinners, and sometimes there is a collateral damage and everyone has to suffer, but still doesn't perfectly work. Another answer, and we saw it in the book of Job, and We saw it last week. We ended with a beautiful passage from the Talmud. If you remember those who came, the angel of death sent his assistant to claim a person, and he told him, get me Miriam. The term for hairdresser was hair raiser. In Hebrew, it makes tiny bit more sense, not too much more sense. And the helper didn't hear well, and he brought him Miriam, the children raiser, meaning the nanny or the preschool teacher, okay? And he killed the wrong person. And when he was confronted, he said, oh, well, mistakes happen. But still, it's okay to add the mistake to my quota of people I have to kill, which basically says, there's a lot of randomness in the world. Okay, so we got all these beautiful ideas, and today we will keep exploring. Any comments, anything so far? Okay. I told you that we're starting with modern era, but I want to start still with a passage from the Talmud, because it will help us to, first of all, I always love to look at interesting passages from the Talmud. This is still the core text. I know we always say Torah, and Torah is super important, but the Talmud has some deep insights that often we're not familiar with, because we have to know how to find them, and we have to know the key of how to read, how to understand them. Nothing esoteric, but still there is a system there. So this is taken from BT, means, remember from last week? Babylonian Talmud, okay, tractate Brachot, which means blessings or prayers. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, why are the sages of those generations called the members of the Great Assembly? So the rabbis in the Talmud refer to a generation of Jewish leaders. Sometimes they call them rabbis, but at that time nobody used the word rabbi. Why do they call them the men of the Great Assembly? And he said it's because they returned the crown of the Holy One, blessed be He. Because they returned basically God's glory. It's hard to understand, but how so? What did they do? Listen to that. Moses came and said his prayer. The way Moses would pray, the way Moses would refer to God is with three adjectives: the great, the mighty, the awesome God. In Hebrew, you heard it many times, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora. We just say it in prayers and sometimes. Okay, so Moses used three adjectives for God: great, mighty, and awesome. See what happens next. Jeremiah the prophet, okay, who came many years after, let's say some 400 or 500 years after Moses, came and said, Gentiles, i.e. the minions of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, are carousing in his sanctuary, meaning they came to the sanctuary, they defiled it, and where is his awesomeness? Therefore, he did not say awesome in his prayer. As it said, the great God, the mighty Lord of hosts is his name. So came a prophet 400 years after Moses and took away an adjective, an attribute from God. He said, God is not so awesome. Why? Because see what the Babylonians did to our temple. If they have so much power to come to the house of God, to do whatever they want in the house of God, maybe, yeah, God is still great, but not awesome. That's a huge statement, right? That the prophet, and that Jeremiah, one of the most important, so no, it's not so awesome. Then Daniel came and said, Gentiles are enslaving his children, God's children, right? Where is his might? Therefore, he did not say mighty in his prayer. All he said was the great and awesome God. So came Daniel, who lived after Jeremiah, and said, God is not so mighty. Why? Because he allowed the Babylonians to enslave the people of Israel. So what kind of a mighty God or a mighty leader or a mighty parent, whatever you want to call God, allows his children to be abused and slaves, oppressed by others? Which means God is not so mighty. Meaning, if we go back to what I said in the beginning, we say that God is omnipotent, all-powerful. So no, maybe God is not so all-powerful. Maybe the Babylonians showing that they are very powerful and they can do things. Okay, is that clear so far? It's fascinating, but it's just the beginning of this beautiful Talmudic thing. So Jeremiah and Daniel later on just took some attributes from God. He's not so awesome, he's not so great. Because of the reality. They lived in a reality that they said, no. Okay, the second paragraph here. The members of the great assembly came and said, on the contrary, this is the might of his might, which means this is the fullest expression of it, that God conquers his inclination in that he exercises patience toward the wicked. I'm going to read it again because this is great. They said, no, God has all these adjectives. Why? What makes God awesome and mighty? He conquers his inclination in that he exercises patience towards the wicked. God's anger is flared by the Gentile nations' enslavement of his people. Yet he expresses tremendous might by suppressing his anger and holding back from punishing them immediately. What exactly is the Talmud saying here? Why God is still mighty and awesome? Because his patience hold back his wrath rather than his because exactly God's might, God's omnipotence comes by his ability not to intervene. When God saw how the Babylonians, that's the historical context here, enslaving, oppressing his people, God's natural reaction would be to intervene, to help his people, to punish the Babylonians, right? But he didn't do it. You know how much strength it takes. I spoke to a parent of a severely drug addict child. Her child was really in a horrible shape. By the way, she is doing well now and got married and has a child. That's a real miracle. She almost died. I saw her at the ICU to say goodbye. And then, okay, but I spoke to her and he said, they told me that the only thing for me to do is to get away, to sever every contact with her. Because each time when she came to me, I took her back. I helped her. I said she still didn't hit rock bottom, and I have to separate myself. And she said, that's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, okay? So I don't think that the rabbis of the Talmud were aware of that concept, but that's exactly, I think, that's a good analogy to the way God felt. I have to help my people, my children. It's not right. But no, I restrain myself. And why would God restrain God's self? Free will. Because if I'm intervening, if I'm punishing the Babylonians, I'm taking away their free will. That's not the way, that's not the concept with which I created the world. Therefore, if you follow me, it is still appropriate to refer to God as mighty, and these acts also expresses his awesomeness. Why is that? Were it is not for the awesomeness of the Holy One, blessed be he, how could one people, meaning the Jewish people, who are alone and hated by the Gentile nations, survive among the nations? So yeah, God is also awesome because despite all the oppression and all the killing and all the massacres and all the anti-Jewishness that always existed, they're still around. Okay, so this was written about 1600 years ago. This is not a post-October 7th. And still we are here. So yeah, God is mighty because God controls God's natural inclination to help his people, and he's awesome because no matter what, he still makes sure that they're around. Because all the nations that existed back then, they disappeared, not the Jewish people. This is good, right? But here is the amazing thing. That's when I talked about the keys or fully understanding or deeply understanding the Talmud. The Gemara, which is another word for the Talmud, asks, and the rabbis, meaning Jeremiah and Daniel, how could they do this and uproot an ordinance instituted by Moses, the greatest teacher who instituted the mention of these attributes in prayer? So, okay, we understand why the men of the Great Assembly decided to bring back these three attributes of God, but how come Jeremiah and Daniel had the audacity to change what Moses said? Who gave them the permission to say God is not awesome or God is not mighty? You cannot just come up and do it, right? Look at this answer, how great it is. Rabbi Alon said, they did so because they knew of the Holy One, blessed be he, that he is truthful and hates a lie. Consequently, they did not speak falsely about him. So why did they take out some of these adjectives? God doesn't like BS. That's what the Talmud says, in a nicer word. They just couldn't bring themselves to say that God was awesome because they didn't think that God acted in an awesome way. They didn't think that God was mighty because the evidence shows the contrary, that God was not acting mightily. And they decided God doesn't want false attributes. God wants to hear the truth. And for them, the truth, in face of all these atrocities that they witnessed, meant, we cannot use all these great adjectives, which is amazing. Now, the key here is that the Talmud often, and we saw it in some of the previous stories, gives us sort of in the beginning the party line. Yes, it's important to have all the attributes of God, but these two, some rabbis said, well, maybe not. They give us permission here, the Talmud, sometimes to look at God and either be angry, disappointed, or to have a more realistic picture of God. Is it clear, this Talmudic text? I think is really beautiful. Okay, the last paragraph is the key here, the descent. Because had the Talmud not wanted us to have the option of saying, maybe God is not so powerful, or God is not so all-knowing, or God is not so good, we can say it. That's why they included. I think that the whole purpose of this Talmudic sugya, phrase or discussion is the last paragraph. Because many of us sometimes think that, even I'm talking about people who are supposed to be 100% believers, have no doubt, and said, it's okay if you do. Because you can rely on the prophet Jeremiah, on Daniel, and rabbis from the Talmud, Maybe God doesn't like to be lied to. And if the evidence is not that God is so great, maybe not. I think it's a really strong statement from 1500 years ago, and I use it as a transition to the more modern text that we're going to discover together. Any comments, questions? Is it clear, this text? It's let's skip Maimonides. As I normally do, I include more texts than I even want to cover in one class. Yes, it's hard not to include Maimonides when you transition from something. And let's go to Rabbi Soloveitchik. Have you heard of Rabbi Soloveitchik? If you grew up modern Orthodox, especially in America, or knew something about modern Orthodoxy, he's the man. Okay, Rabbi Soloveitchik was the head of Yeshiva University, which is a fabulous institution in New York, still a rabbinical school of the modern Orthodox student, and he was an extremely smart man, and he has his own philosophy about it. Okay, so that's Rabbi Soloveitchik. If you read things that are written by students of Yeshiva University, and most modern Orthodox synagogues have a rabbi who went to Yeshiva University. Okay, these are the intellectuals. It's not Chabad, or these are the people who really studied seriously. They just call him Harav, the rabbi. And everyone knows who they refer to. Just Harav said, they don't even need the name. Okay, like some synagogues, like the synagogue in Atlanta is called the Temple. Why coming up with a name? I mean, there's only one temple, right? No, but here's Harav. Okay, so let's look at the quotes, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Oh. Okay. Maybe some of you have slightly, I keep until probably 6 o'clock refining my text. And what I'm holding is the one before the last. The content is the same, it's just not as clean as I like it to be. So I don't know what you have here. But number 2 is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And just the core ideas, because some of these texts are difficult to understand, and if you happen to take it home and look at it in a few weeks and not sure about what the text means, I included just a little synopsis of the core idea. Don't seek to understand evil, but respond to it. Suffering is a catalyst for spiritual growth and demands actions. Halacha, Jewish law, guides us to find meaning in suffering and act ethically in its presence. We're going to look at the text, but Soloveitchik believed in halacha, in Jewish law. To be a good Jew is not what you believe in, it's not what you think, it's what you do, okay? Many people think that this is the only way to look at Judaism. I'm telling you that's not true. But according to Soloveitchik, who bases it on Maimonides, this is the purely rational or rationalistic Jew, it's what you do. Okay? That's why only in a synagogue, rather than churches or mosques, I believe that if I ask in a service who believes in God, I believe that at least a third of the people would not raise their hands. And when I mentioned it to my Christian colleagues, they thought that it's my English that made it not. I said, what do you mean people come to the synagogue if they don't believe in God? You cannot come to church if you don't believe in God. I mean, you can, I guess, but the whole notion is that you believe in Jesus and God. Okay? But in synagogues, if I really ask, or I don't want to ask because it's a personal thing, but it's not a big deal. And there are many stories, right? Around, but I cannot believe in God. They come to the rabbi and say, do you give tzedakah? Yeah, of course I give tzedakah. I mean, of course, you're a good Jew. Just shut up and do what you need to. But we have this notion, okay, and Soloveitchik is one of the students and teachers of this idea. And when it comes to suffering, he's consistent with his theology. So let's read a few quotes. Okay. We do not inquire about the hidden ways of the Almighty, but rather about the path wherein man shall talk when suffering strikes. In other words, Soloveitchik says, it doesn't really matter why evil and suffering exist. What matters is what we are doing about it. The actions, the halacha. In a way, we don't even need to think about it. That's not our business. As Jews, it's what we do. Okay? So, okay, you don't understand, that's perfectly fine, but it's not important. The important thing is the doing. The second point, the human mind is simply not equipped to tackle this problem. We're not smart enough, we just don't have it. To engage in theodicy, I wanted to, let me pause because it's a word I wanted to mention before. Theodicy is a key here, which means the justification of God. Okay? Theodicy, this will be the key word today. Theodicy, the justification of God. Until the Holocaust, most of the writings we encounter deal with theodicy, explaining suffering, explaining why bad things happen. In a way, we justify God. Yeah, it's not, we don't understand, we're not smart enough, but that's the idea of theodicy. We'll see this word and this concept many times. So human mind is simply not equipped to tackle this problem. To engage in theodicy is an exercise in futility. Who are we? These lowly creatures who try to justify God, right? Who are we? What do I know? What do I understand? Instead of looking for the explanation for our fate, for example, why particular evil has struck us, we should ask ourselves how we can respond to evil in a manner that will enable us to emerge from this experience as better moral and spiritual beings. So instead of asking, why is it happened to me? Why is it happening in the world? Why did things happen? Okay, it happened. The question of why it happened is irrelevant. What are we doing about it now? Okay, October 7th happened. Okay, what did people in Israel do? What many of us did immediately. You know, this is when we get all the, okay, how can we help? Who should we send money for? Okay, so in Israel, it was amazing. It never happened something like that in the history of Israel. That everyone, they realized the government did not function, the military stopped functioning at least in the first day or so. We need to do things. We need to feed people. We need to do many things. We need to control social media. We have to get the narrative. And regular people, instead of just dwelling on how did it happen, we'll have time later on for why it happened. Okay? So that's the October 7th connection. What are we doing now? They don't have this protective vest. How can we get vests for our soldiers? There are so many reservists who just don't have cars or cannot get to the base. How can we do it? Okay, that's what basically Soloveitchik is saying. But he's saying it theologically, goes deeper. I just said something that is not so much Soloveitchik. I said, we'll deal with it later. The government of Israel, by the way, does not want to deal with it. So it refuses, the prime minister refuses to have a committee, an unbiased committee to investigate what happened. But forget about politics, I cannot tear myself completely from it. No, because October 7th is one of the catalysts for me that I even thought more about this evil and why things happen. But the civil society in Israel just did not waste a second of why. What are we doing now? And that's what Soloveitchik is saying. For two reasons. First of all, maybe it's futile, but also we're not equipped with the knowledge. If to go back to the image that I gave you before, which I did not think much about, but the ants, right? Think about the ants just having these conferences and all these, why do people step on us? What did we do to justify these ugly shoes on? You know, they cannot understand why it happens. So we are a little bit better than ants. Probably somebody would say that our DNA is 90% similar to an ant. That's not my field. I know that about 99% 98% like monkeys. But we don't think what we're doing. Okay, so this is Soloveitchik. Very important, still the mythological leader of modern Orthodoxy. Okay, any comments about Soloveitchik or this idea? Yes, Audrey.
Yeah, I just had I assume it's a typo, but it's not a typo, but it changes the whole meaning. In the first little circle thing, it's wherein man shall, and it says talk, and I think it should be walk, because talk is not like an action thing, but I think they're talking about.
Men shall walk, thank you.
I don't mean to be picky, I mean it changes the whole meaning.
You're right, shall walk, because halacha, the word halacha, Jewish law, comes from the Hebrew word halach. Do you know what halach is? Walk. So halacha, Jewish law, is the way we walk, the way we just function in the world. Okay, so thank you, Audrey, for catching this very important typo, and it's definitely a reference. It's a word that was chosen, especially in Hebrew, to imply halacha, Jewish law. What do you do as a Jew? Not what you think, what you feel. This is Soloveitchik. I want to continue with Eliezer Berkowitz. And Berkowitz is known as one of the most important post-Holocaust theologists. I shrank it from 10 pages to only 5. And I still try to think, oh, what did I include? What the last? Let's see what is the core idea of Berkowitz. God's self-limitation allows for human free will, even if it means the possibility of great evil. Okay, we talked about it. God gave us free will, because if we don't have free will, how can God reward or punish us, or what kind of a relationship it is if everything is predetermined? There are religions that believe that everything is predetermined, right? That God controlled everything, and since the moment we're born to the moment we die, everything is known, everything is controlled, right? The script is written, and there are no deviations from it. Judaism believes in free will. That's why this is the first story about Adam and Eve. God told them, don't eat, but gave them the option of eating. If God didn't want them to eat, God would have created a world in which we don't choose to eat or not to eat. Okay, so this is a fundamental idea about the relationship of God and humanity. So what Berkowitz is saying, and it just reiterates the idea, God's self-limitation allows for human free will, even if it means the possibility of great evil. The Holocaust demands a rethinking of traditional theodicies, remember this word, the justification of God, but not a rejection of God. God is not absent, but hidden, allowing humanity to grapple with evil. We'll see some of the quotes that will make it a little bit clearer here. But he's saying that, yeah, free will, but the Holocaust created a new situation. We love the idea of free will, right? When we have children, grandchildren, students, whatever, we give them freedom. We try to give them more freedom, but we always have our limits. Okay, you can play only in the backyard, but if I see you running to the road, you're in trouble. Okay, we want them to learn, but we always set some limits. God wants us to learn, because when we can choose the way we behave, this is much more meaningful relationship between us and God. This is the idea of a covenant, right? I have expectations of you. That's the way I want you to act, but you can do whatever you want. But the Holocaust takes it too far. And why is that? Give me one example in which we know something that you all know from the very past, that God kept the idea of free will until there was a time in which God said, they went too far. Passover. The Exodus story. So you can explain, why did God allow the Egyptians to oppress and enslave our people? They have free will. It happened. They went, they didn't like them, enslaved them, the whole thing. That's not the question. The question is, how come God decided to intervene? And it says it explicitly in the book of Exodus. God just decided, these Egyptians took it too far. I have to come down or to find Moses or whatever means I'm using to intervene in history, because this is too much. So free will, even in the Jewish tradition, has its limits. Okay, when it gets out of control, and nobody can say that the Holocaust did not go out of control, if we would have expected God to intervene at one point, right? This is just, there is mathematics of big numbers. It's different. So Berkovich is saying it's not that God was absent, but God was hidden. God chose to hide. In Hebrew, there is, in Rabbinic Hebrew, an idea of hester panim, when you hide your face. So that's, if you can envision, God just said, I don't see, right? I just don't see, because if I'll see, I'll have to intervene. So God decided to hide God's face. Let's read, and it will get a little bit easier. Now, all these texts, I'm not trying to sell you anything. You don't need to agree with anything, right? I just wanted to see how people struggled and grappled with this issue. So number 3, these little circles, as Audrey called them. God's presence in history is manifest through his absence. Look, listen to that, that's big. God's presence in history is manifest through his absence. And it's true, in the beginning of the Torah, God is always there. Hey, Eve, why did you eat the fruit? Hey, Cain, why did you kill your brother? Hey, Moses, go to the Pharaoh, right? God is part of people's life. And then at one point, God is not here. The books of God are here, the will of God, the expectations of God, but when was the last event in which we know that God came and were among the people? Mount Sinai, when God revealed the Torah, was probably the last time. That's why they call it theophany, the appearance of God in the world was a big deal. God came to give us the Torah, but that's it. Okay, so God is there watching. The Hasidic rabbis would say that sometimes God is crying when bad things are happening, but God is not interfering. The hiding of the face is not theological explanation of anything that happens in history. It is rather an interpretation of the very absence of history. I'm skipping to the next little circle. The question is not where was God in Auschwitz. The question is where was man? And the question is also where were the enlightened, in parentheses, nations of the world? Okay? He said, we know God didn't have a job in Auschwitz. God's role in the world is not to change the reality. That's not the question. The question is, how come people made choices the way they made? How come people chose either to kill or to ignore the killing or to support the killing? Yeah, God knows, God can, but God chooses not to. That's the point, and it's a hard point here. And many will say, we get it as a philosophy, but that's not the kind of God we are willing to live with. And the post-Holocaust, or the Holocaust, is just that event that shattered it, even for people who always justified God. People always say, no, it's the will of God, and sometimes we don't understand. So we'll see Rabbi Kushner later on. Time goes way too fast in this class. But he tells a story of a meeting with a Christian clergy, and who told him, Rabbi Kushner wrote the famous book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, after he lost his son Aaron, and he became probably the best known Jew. This book was on the bestseller list for years. And mostly non-Jews read the book and got a lot from it. We'll look at it a little bit later. So a Christian clergy called him and said, let me tell you something that happened. I was about to do a wedding on Sunday. On Saturday, a drunk driver hit the groom and killed him. Okay, and now instead of a wedding, I have to do a funeral. That's not a story. That happens. Unfortunately, when you're a clergy for a long time, it happened. But here's the story. He said the future wife, or the current, she's not even a widow, I don't know, the woman who was supposed to marry came to the minister and said, please, when you do the funeral, just don't say it was God's will. He said, because after my future husband was killed, people come to me and said, it was God's will, God's will. And said, and I don't understand why people want me to hate God so much. This is a good point, right? So if everything is God's will, well, let's look at okay, so the question, he says, it's not about God's will, it's about man's will. The Holocaust was not, God did not build Auschwitz and Dachau. The Germans did. And those who did not resist them, and the rest of the world that did, okay? This is the question, he says. So don't put it on God if you're consistent with goodwill, with free will. If you believe that we have free will, don't ask God why it happened. Ask how humanity allowed it to happen, how humanity chose to exercise free will in such an evil way. Let's skip Hockenheim, very important, look at it later. It's less an explanation, it just says, just don't let Hitler win. And Hitler will win when there are no Jews. Okay, so no matter how angry you are with God, how disappointed, if we let Judaism go, Hitler won. And for him, the 11th commandment after the Holocaust is, thou shalt not let Hitler win. For generations, by the way, it was the argument that we try to use keeping our children Jewish. Let me tell you a secret. It's not working anymore. So if you try to use it, forget about it. It worked. But if you tell them, 8 years later, you have to be Jewish and you have to raise your kid, because of Hitler, very seldom it will work. Okay? But that's where it came from, this Jewish continuity. We have to do it. And some even say we have to make up for the 1/3 of our nation that was destroyed in the Holocaust, okay? And if we stop being Jewish, we just do what Hitler really was planning. But it's not working. I'm talking now like a rabbi from experience and reading other things. Okay, let's go to Richard Rubinstein, which really interesting here. I'm going to the little circles immediately. Number 5, if you're still following me. The Holocaust irrevocably shattered the traditional Jewish belief in a God who is both all-powerful and all-good. He argues that after Auschwitz, it is impossible to maintain faith in a God who actively covenants with Israel and intervenes in history. The traditional God of the covenant died in the Holocaust. That's what he's famous for, to say that God died. But he doesn't say there is no God. Quotes can be so dangerous sometimes because it does not. He said the idea of covenant with God, something that traditional Jews even say is part of Shema. If you follow my commandments and follow my way and walk in my path, good things will happen. If not, bad things will happen. He said, yeah, we might have been able to hold into this concept, what they call the covenantal God, for 3,000 years. Not anymore. The Holocaust broke it, made it impossible to believe in this kind of God. Because if there was really a covenant between us, the way that we learn that God will reward and punish, God would have done something, but God didn't. Okay? He argues that after Auschwitz, it is impossible to maintain faith in God who is actively... Let's go to now circle number 2. I did not mean that no Jew could any longer believe in God after Auschwitz, but rather that any Jew who did believe had to do so in full awareness that the traditional Jewish understanding of a redeeming personal God active in history could no longer be sustained. Believe in God, but don't hold the same theology, the same set of belief that God intervenes in history, that God is a personal God who thinks and cares about you and your neighbors and your community. Because if that's the God, there is no way in the world to explain Auschwitz. Little things here and there you can, but no, not anymore, he says. Okay, so that's why we call it the post-Holocaust theology. Because all the other pogroms before, and the really horrible things happened to the Jewish people, we still use this phrase that in Hebrew it says, "Mipnei chataenu galenu me'artzenu," because of our sins, we were exiled. Okay, all the bad things that happened to us, because of us. Okay, so it's maybe for all these years, but not anymore. Sorry, we have to change the concept of God. So don't get rid of God, just the way we think of God. Circle 3, while rejecting the traditional God, Rubinstein does not reject Judaism. He advocates for a reinterpretation of Jewish tradition, focusing on the importance of human community, solidarity, and shared history. He sees Jewish rituals and practices as providing meaning and structure in a meaningless world, not as expression of faith in a supernatural being. Light Shabbat candles, but not because you think that God cares whether or not you light Shabbat candles, because this beautiful ritual creates a different atmosphere in your home, in your community, okay? Go to the synagogue or celebrate, because being part of a Jewish community is really important. But you really think that God listens to every word that you're saying, and God is marked, he said it well, and his Hebrew pronunciation is amazing, wow. No, stop with that. But still believe in Judaism, still believe in the power of rituals. Not for the sake of the kind of God that you thought existed, but because these rituals are important. You know, many super rational people, when somebody dies, rituals are what you need to do. Right? You tear your clothes or the black ribbon, and you do this thing. You don't ask, why should I do that? What the rationale? What's the psychological effect? No, sometimes you need somebody to tell you, that's what you're doing now. And you just do it because you need it. So he said, all these things have a huge value. Don't get rid of them. But stop believing in that kind of a God that you thought existed before. And then he had to explain some of these things, so I included more of his text. We live in a time of the death of God. This is not to say that I do not believe in God. I do, but the God in whom I believe is not a God of traditional theism, Theism meaning believing in God. The death of God is a cultural fact. The tragedy of Auschwitz is that it was not an act of God, but of man. It was made possible by the advance of human rationality and technology. There is no divine purpose in the Holocaust, no divine retribution, no divine anything. And this is super important, and I said it a few times. Don't say that the Holocaust was needed to create the state of Israel. It makes me sick when I hear it. I just don't believe that you sacrifice 6 million people to create a state. Okay? Don't try to find this meaning. You know, politically or historically, when you analyze, and we did it in our previous class, I did say that I think that the Holocaust was a major factor that convinced the rest of the world that the Jews need a state. And I'm not sure that without the Holocaust, the UN had voted to approve that Palestine will be half Jewish and half not, the partition plan. Okay? But I'm not saying, and I cringe when I hear it, that God created the Holocaust or in order to continue to the next phase. And I hear it a lot, and I read it a lot in Israeli papers, and it really makes me sick. I cannot always try to be neutral. When people say, especially from the far right in Israel, that October 7th was part of God's plan because now we will have Gaza. Now Jews will be able to go back to Gaza and settle this holy land. That, by the way, anyone who knows Jewish history, Gaza was never part of any Jewish state. It was a Philistine territory. We were never in Gaza, okay? So, but it doesn't matter. But people say it now openly. Or another example, after the Holocaust, and even today I hear people say that the reason God brought the Holocaust because of the reform movement that changed tradition. These people just started to break everything that was important, and God had to do something significant to change it. How do you explain that most of the people who died in the Holocaust was the most traditional, most devout, observant Jews? But just saying that, okay? And that's what he's saying. By the way, even to say the reverse is very dangerous. Whenever something really bad happens, there are always, but always stories about the person who was supposed to be there and ended up not being there. Okay, so after October 7th, there are all these stories. I was supposed to go to this festival, and the last minute I didn't. I don't know, my car broke or something. But what about all the other people who did go? Okay, and I know you have your own story that is just the opposite. So these stories also make me uncomfortable, because what about the rest? So you think that God loves only you and hates everyone else who got hurt? I don't think so. Okay, let's skip Heschel today. It's normally not a nice thing to skip Heschel because he was really very important. He was associated with the conservative movement of JTS. You probably saw his picture a million times marching, holding hands with Martin Luther King. Okay, this rabbi with the big hair. Still? There were more, no, there are more academics. Yes, they are academic. Soloveitchik is a modern Orthodox, and Heschel is conservative, very liberal, and but he said amazing things. And if you are dying to read the book, a short, super important book, read the book The Sabbath, but Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's a small, amazing book that explains so much about Judaism. I included it, but not. Let's look at Kushner. Who read Kushner's book? Okay, so he's not considered to be a theologian or a philosopher, but again, his book was so important when it was written, and today, or since it was written, people deal with it. either accept it, reject it, but you respond to it. Because first of all, it came from a really good place. So Rabbi Kushner is a conservative rabbi, very important rabbi, but nobody knew much about him, at least not nationally, before the book. He had the son, Aaron, who was diagnosed with a disease of rapid aging, progeria, thank you. And he knew from an early point that he will lose his son. And he started to struggle with it as a rabbi. You know, it's one thing to teach, but when it happens to you, you start thinking and looking and feeling things completely differently. So he wrote this book. It's a small book. If anyone, by the way, wants a copy, I have copies to give out, because somebody one time gave me 20 copies. And he wrote this book. So let's have a few quotes from Kushner. God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some are simply an inevitable consequence of our being human and being mortal, living in a world of inflexible natural laws. Okay, that's nature. Okay, if there is a tsunami tomorrow or a hurricane and somebody gets hurt, it's not that God wanted to, that's nature. That's, by the way, Maimonides says it too. Part of evil is because we live in a natural world. A natural world has phenomena that hurts, but that's the world. Or Maimonides would say, we live in a world when there's human nature, and part of human nature is evil. Each one of us has a bad side too. Maybe not in this group, but outside of this room. No, we all have this mix. By the way, that's one of the reasons that the main problem of the rabbis in the time of the Talmud and even before was the Persian tradition, the Zoroastrians, who believed in two gods. And you know, we ridicule it, but it makes so much more sense. Why? Because there is God of good, or the good God, and the evil God. And they struggle all the time. And when things are good, yeah, because the good God prevails. When bad things happen, well, you know, today is a bad day because the bad God is stronger. Okay, so I super simplified it, but it was a very appealing philosophy. Because if there's one God and this God is good, how come there is bad? It's much easier to work with two gods. One is good, one is bad. So there is place for evil in the world, as there is place for good in the world. And when you think of your life, there is good and bad. This is everyone's experience. So two gods make a lot of sense. And the rabbis had to fight it. Because what is the first line that we're saying? The Lord is one. But the oneness of God creates some very serious philosophical questions. Let's read, you know what, before Kushner, I'll just tell you what go on.
Christians believe in Satan. I think most of them do. The Jews have a Satan.
In our first class, we read part of the book of Job. And there is description of God with the angels, and one of them is Satan. Now, it's not the Antichrist, it's not exactly the same. By the way, that's a nice plug. Next week, we'll start working with comparative religion, and I will talk about it. Because Satan in Judaism and Satan in Christianity and Satan in Islam, completely different. So it can be one word with different meaning. So we use the same word, we use even in English, the devil, but different concept. So we'll see even next week, because I really wanted to teach it because these three religions deal with suffering on a different level. Wow.
was all-knowing, all-loving, but that God had an evil inclination and a good inclination, and that he had choices just like we, that he provided humans, the rest of us, with the same balance in his will that he had in ours. And the only way I could accept that there was any meaningful reason for leaving good people, and that I too was a good person who was experiencing all that, is that God was not all-knowing, not all good, and had the right to make those decisions. Now, I don't know if that's philosophically acceptable. That's how I rationalize and really give up on faith.
So let me go first to the halachically kosher, acceptable. That's why I brought so many quotes from the Talmud and from the most traditional sources to show you, because what you said now, that was the first passage from the Talmud we looked at. Jeremiah said, oh, God is not awesome. God is not all-powerful, so I'm not going to say it in my prayers. Okay, so if Jeremiah can say it, you can say it. I mean, no, but that's why the Talmud brought it, because the Talmud, at least in this, in a sort of a Latin way, tells us it's okay to feel like that, because even Jeremiah and Daniel felt like that.
Some way of reconciling and accepting what I couldn't change. That was the only way I could do it. That there was an evil inclination and a good inclination. And unfortunately, what occurred was an evil inclination that I had to cope with and deal with.
In the book of Genesis, one of the first and the most important things is the line that God created us in God's image. Okay, so that's, so if God created us in God's image, you can go both ways, but you can say, no, we know that we have bad and good, which means that we're in the image of an entity, of a deity who has bad and good. Okay, so you said it, and Kushner says it, and it's true, or at least from our perspective. Okay, it's true, but the rabbis always struggled because of the Persian theology that of the two gods. So we say there is one God with two aspects, just like each one of us. But you can see how easy it is to go from one God with two aspects of good and bad to actually maybe there are two gods. So let's read a little bit from Kushner, and then if anyone wants to say something. So number 7, God is not, we read that. The second little circle, I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die. By giving us a conscience to guide us, fellow human beings to strengthen, by giving us a conscience to guide us, fellow human beings to strengthen us, and a sense of our own worth to call on when all else fails. And he says it just in all of his books that have a similar theme. He said, I don't know why my son died. I don't know why we suffer, but I know God did not kill my son. And when I need support, God is there with me. So the role of God in the world is not to prevent cancer and other illnesses and tsunamis. And God is there to be with us when we are hurt by all the evil things in the world. Okay? So someone say it's simplistic, but it can be helpful if you subscribe to it. So instead of saying, why did God let it happen? That happens. That's the world. There is a lot of randomity in the world. It happens. But God's role is not to prevent it. It's to be with us. Because when something happens, 3 deaths in 13 months, nobody knows how you feel. All the friends and all the family members are there, but nobody knows. And he describes it in one of these books. I'm sorry that I don't remember where he wrote what, but he says, only God, I believe, that when I cannot fall asleep at night, only God can understand what I'm going through. Okay, so that's his role for God. Not to prevent, not to control, but to be with us when we need comfort and support. So Kushner, yeah, and today was the funeral, and you probably saw some pictures. So just using Kushner now, he will tell you, okay, it's of course, it was not God's role to prevent the Hamas from doing it, and God will be with Yarden, the father of Bibas, and help him. But he will say more. He said the support that the Bibas family, today there were tens of thousands of people at the funeral, and the whole world is talking about it, and the color orange, even the Empire State Building, and I believe that the Niagara Falls, if I remember correctly, were all painted orange. And he said, that's God. He said, that's when God is, to react after the evil happened, to help in any way possible. And the way we act, if we help in any way, as we'll talk about angels maybe in the next few weeks, but angels, for the most part in Judaism, are not these things with wings, but are people who happen to be in the right place, the right time, doing God's work, or manifesting the good side of God. So I don't know how Yarden Bibas can keep living. I cannot comprehend it at all. You know, just like you, I still have nightmares. And here, some of your, you know, we have 2 little kids in the preschool with redheads. And they are as sweet, and some of us, whenever we see them, we cringe. Because one of them is just turned 1, and, you know, we saw them all, and so it's so painful. So I don't know. I don't know. I think that I wouldn't have been able to find any strength to keep going, but I read what he's doing. He's amazing. He's amazing. He wants to live, and he wants to, actually we started with Soloveitchik, said, okay, I'm not asking right now why, but what can we do? It happened, what can I do? How can I leverage this situation to create a better society, to create a better world? My sons and wife are not coming back. But what can I do after it happened? Again, I don't have an answer. I don't. That's why it's very easy for me, and that's what I'm doing, to hide behind all these texts and all these theologies and philosophies, because I don't know. And it's a true story. It happened less than a week ago. I went to visit a friend from the temple who is younger than me and is about to die any day from cancer. And she asked, why me? Why did this happen to me? You know, I didn't do anything to, not just morally, I mean physically. I never looked at a cigarette. I never ate anything bad. I did everything, and why? And there was nothing I could say. I held her hand. What could I really? What, to start? Oh, let's open Fackenheim or Heschel or. But these things, at least for me, the therapeutic effect of that is that it helps me to think in different ways, to look at it in different ways. But as I said in the very first class, it's a great thing that I learned. in one of the grad schools. When there is more than one answer, it means that none of them is satisfying. And when you have dozens of different theologies that try to explain evil, it means that there isn't even one good one. Because if there was a good one, we would all have followed it. And I'm just, oh wow, now it makes sense to me, thank you. But we don't. So the purpose of this class was just to expose us to different ways of looking at it and to admit nothing really works, or maybe one of them works for you, which is wonderful. Okay? And I think Kushner, in his little book, he really thought initially, I believe, that, few thousand Jews will buy his book, because how many people buy rabbis' books? And that it became this phenomenon because people need a simple way to think about it. By simple, I don't mean bad, right? Something that talks to their hearts, not to their brain, and the book talks to the heart. And some of the people I know read it and said, didn't help me. But they still enjoyed reading the book. They didn't agree with what he said at the end, but it helped them a little bit. And Jonathan Sachs, we will skip, it's interesting. And David Chance, and Primo Levi at the very end, number 5. I alluded to it before. Primo Levi was a Jewish Italian chemist and author. He survived the Holocaust, and he ended up dying of suicide. It was just too much, but he wrote a lot. And I like this, difficult to read, but I think it's my personal biases that, or things that, I don't know how to explain evil, but I know what triggers my anger when other people try to explain evil, why things happen, okay? So it's part of his book. Now, each of us is busy scraping the bottom of his bowl with his spoon so as to pick up the last drop of soup, a confused metallic clatter signifying the end of the day. Okay, we all know enough about the Holocaust to see how meager was the food and how every drop was essential. A few more calories, you can sustain yourself a little bit longer. Silence slowly prevails, and then from my bunk, on the top level, I see and hear old Kuhn praying aloud. With his cap on his hand, his torso swaying violently. Kuhn is thanking God that he was not chosen, okay, for the selectia, the selection of who shall live and who shall die another day, right? Kuhn is out of his mind. Does he not see in the bunk next to him Beppo the Greek, who is 20 years old and is going to the gas chamber the day after tomorrow and knows it and lies there staring at the light without saying anything and without even thinking anymore? Does Kuhn not know that next time it will be his turn? Does Kuhn not understand that what happened today is an abomination which no proprietary prayer, no pardon, no expiation by the guilty, nothing at all in the power of man to do can ever heal? If I were God, I would spit Kuhn's prayer out to the ground. In other words, Kuhn said, oh, thank you, God, that I was not selected to be gassed in the chambers. He said, what are you doing? It's not right. What about all the others? What are you doing to the memory, to the destiny of the others if you think that you were chosen? I was the one who just missed the bus and didn't make it to the bad event, okay? Do you really think that you're better than others? Yeah, many people tell the stories like they're better. I said, no, that's wrong. That's not. God does not deserve it, and that's definitely not the way God worked. So I think it was probably the most difficult class, emotionally speaking, that I ever taught. It's probably one of the least satisfying classes that I ever taught. I think from the perspective of, okay, what's the answer? I don't really know, because I don't really think there is an answer. I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that I do believe in God. I also believe that the world is much more random than I want it to be, that bad things happen because this is the kind of world we have. This is nature, and this is human nature. And I think that the cost of getting rid of God, of throwing God out of my life, is much greater than accepting the imperfect God that adds meaning to my life. That's me. That's my personal, shallow, but working for me theology, okay? I tried, and I'm still trying to find other ways to deal with it. We'll look next time at Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. They bring some other angles, but I can tell you, I didn't find any of their theologies working better. So I really thank you. I really appreciate that you came to a class like that, it's really not fun, but hopefully you got something from it. And I hope that you'll choose to join me next week already to the comparative religion. I just want to tell you, I chose few subjects to compare. The first class, I'll just mention few differences between Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. But just remember, I'm a rabbi. I have enough knowledge about Judaism. I have less knowledge, as much as I studied, about Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Okay, so it's not an academic comparative religion when you go to take a class taught by a person who is equally expert in all these religions. So I just want you to know what you are getting, and I'm not pretending. I'm teaching it as a rabbi, as a Jew, okay? So I put it to you as it is. Thank you. I really appreciate it.